I was 23 that summer, and this happened back in 2014, a year I still think about more than I'd like to admit. I'd taken time off work to do a solo camping trip, partly because I loved being outdoors, and partly because I needed space from people. Life felt loud back then. I wanted quiet, real quiet. I drove out to a stretch of wilderness outside a small town called Pine Hollow, tucked deep in the northern part of Monmere County. It wasn't a famous place. No postcards, no crowds. Just trees, dirt trails, and long stretches where you could walk for hours without seeing another human being. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car at the end of a gravel road and hiked in a few miles until I found a clearing near a creek. It felt safe enough, open enough that I could see around me, but still surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the wind. I pitched my tent, set up my gear, and planned to stay 2 nights before heading home. The first 2 days were uneventful. No people, no animals bigger than squirrels. Just wind through the trees and the constant soft rush of water nearby. By the afternoon of the second day, I had a small fire going and was heating up food. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. Almost too peaceful. That's when I noticed someone standing on the edge of the clearing. I hadn't heard footsteps, no snapping twigs, no warning at all. 1 second I was alone, and the next there was a man just there. I jumped to my feet so fast I nearly knocked over my pot. He raised his hands a little, like he was trying to show he meant no harm. He looked like a hiker. Big backpack, dirty boots, a jacket that had seen better days. His beard was uneven, like he'd tried and failed to trim it recently. "Hey," he said. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Didn't mean to scare you." I nodded, trying to slow my breathing. "You kind of did?" I said, forcing a small laugh. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry about that. I was just wondering. Do you know where the old shelter is?" I knew what he meant right away. Along some of the trails out there were these tiny emergency cabins, barely more than wooden boxes. No doors sometimes, no windows. Just a place to hide if the weather turned bad. I'd never used one, but earlier that day I'd noticed a narrow side path leading off the main trail. It looked barely used, almost swallowed by weeds. "I think there might be one down that way," I said, pointing. "Not totally sure, though." "That helps," he said. "Thanks." He turned and walked off without another word, disappearing into the trees, so quietly it was like he'd never been there at all. I stood there for a while after that, listening, waiting to hear something. But the woods went right back to normal, like they'd swallowed him whole. I shrugged it off. People hike out there sometimes. It wasn't impossible. Still, the way he'd appeared without a sound stayed in the back of my mind. That evening, I kept my fire going longer than usual. The sun started sinking, but it never really got dark. That strange half-light hung over everything, stretching shadows in long, thin shapes between the trees. I was packing up my food when I saw movement again. Same man. He stepped out of the trees like he'd been waiting for the exact right moment. "I couldn't find it," he said, like we were continuing a conversation we'd never finished. "The shelter?" I asked. He nodded. "Didn't even see the trail you mentioned." That confused me. The path wasn't obvious, but it wasn't invisible either. "It's back there," I said again. I might have been wrong, though. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Any chance you could show me?" "I don't have a tent." Was counting on that place. I hesitated. Every part of me didn't want to go anywhere with him. But then I remembered something important. He wasn't a complete stranger. A year earlier, we'd met briefly at a family reunion. Turns out he was a distant cousin by marriage. Barely related, but enough that we'd exchanged names and small talk once. I hadn't recognized him at first, but now it clicked. That made saying no harder. "All right," I said finally. "It's not far. I grabbed my pack and we started walking. The forest felt different once we were under the trees. The air was thicker, quieter. Even the bugs seemed to stop buzzing. Our footsteps sounded too loud, like we were breaking some kind of rule just by being there. He didn't talk much. Neither did I. Every now and then I glanced back at him. He was always watching me. Not the path, not the trees, me. After about 10 minutes, I saw it, the trail, clear as day, and beyond it, partially hidden, was the shelter. I stopped and pointed. There, that's it. He frowned. That's not right. I laughed nervously. That's the only thing it could be. We walked closer. The cabin looked worse up close. Boards warped and blackened. One window smashed. The door hanging crooked. It smelled like wet rot and old dirt. I turned to say something, and that's when I realized he'd stopped walking. He stood behind me, about 10 feet away. He was holding a knife. It wasn't big. That somehow made it worse. Go inside, he said. His voice was flat, empty. My heart slammed against my ribs. What are you doing? I asked. Inside, he repeated. I didn't think. I dropped my pack and ran. Branches whipped my face. Roots grabbed at my boots. I expected to hear him chasing me, breathing hard, crashing through the woods. Nothing. When I looked back, he was still there, watching. I hid for what felt like forever. When I finally crept back, my pack was gone. So was he. I headed back to my campsite, shaking with every step. My fire was burning, and my pack was sitting right in the middle of the clearing. Then I heard humming. He stepped into the light, calm as could be, like he owned the place. I didn't wait. I ran until my legs gave out. The next morning, authorities found nothing. No campsite, no shelter signs, no man, just trees. I still don't camp alone anymore, and I never follow anyone into the woods again. I'm going to tell you about something that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. This happened back in 2017, when I was in my mid-20s. At the time, I was working a boring warehouse job and trying to save money. One of the few things that helped me clear my head was camping. I didn't do it to feel brave or adventurous. I did it because being alone in the woods felt quieter than my own thoughts. That trip, though, I wasn't alone. I went with my older cousin, Mark. We weren't super close growing up, but once we were adults, we started hanging out more. Mark was the outdoorsy type. He was always hiking, fishing, or planning trips that involved being far away from other people. He was the one who suggested we do a short camping trip together. The place he picked was a stretch of thick forest in northern Idaho, near an area locals called Cold Pine Ridge. It wasn't a campground. No signs, no bathrooms, no marked sites. Just miles of trees, hills, and old logging paths that hadn't been used in years. Mark had been there once before with some friends, but this would be my first time. We drove out early in the morning and parked near an abandoned dirt road. From there, we hiked for hours. The deeper we went, the quieter everything got. No traffic noise. No distant voices. Even the birds seemed to thin out the farther we walked. By the time we reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the sun was already starting to dip. That's where we decided to set up camp. The ground was flat. The trees were thick enough to block the wind, and there was a faint trail nearby that led to a stream. We got the tents up, built a fire ring, and cooked some simple food. Nothing fancy, just canned stuff and hot dogs. We laughed, joked around, and talked about random things. Old family stories, dumb work stuff, plans we'd probably never follow through on. Everything felt normal, comfortable. As night settled in, the woods changed. The air got heavier. The shadows between the trees felt deeper than they should have been. The fire was the only thing keeping the darkness back, and beyond its glow, it felt like the forest just swallowed everything. About an hour or two after sunset, we heard something. It wasn't loud. That was the problem. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, just beyond where the firelight reached. Not crashing through brush. Not running, just moving. Like someone trying very hard not to be heard. Mark and I both went quiet at the same time. We stared into the darkness, waiting to see something step into the light. Nothing did. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Mark shrugged it off and said it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to. Out there, animals make noise all the time. You learn not to jump at every sound. Still, I remember feeling like we were being watched. The rest of the night passed without anything else happening. Eventually, we put the fire out and crawled into our tents. I didn't sleep great. Every time the wind moved the trees or something rustled nearby, my eyes snapped open. Morning came and the fear faded with the daylight. There was a reason Mark wanted to camp there. About a half-mile away, hidden off one of those old paths, was a small lake. It wasn't on any map. It had dark water, a rocky edge, and a narrow waterfall feeding into it. The place felt untouched, like people weren't meant to hang out there. We spent most of the morning by the lake, skipping rocks, sitting in silence, letting time pass. It was peaceful in a strange way. Later, we went back to camp to eat and rest. I laid down in my tent and dozed off for a bit. When I woke up, the light had changed. The sun was lower, and the shadows were stretching again. That's when we realized we hadn't gathered enough firewood. Most of what was nearby had already been used the night before, so we split up. I stayed closer to camp, picking up fallen branches. Mark said he was going to walk around and explore a bit, maybe find better wood farther out. He did stuff like that all the time. I didn't think much of it. After a while, I went back to camp and stacked the wood. I figured Mark would be back any minute, but the minutes stretched on. The light kept fading, and he didn't show up. That uneasy feeling crept back in. We didn't have phone service out there. The only way we could contact each other was with these small satellite messengers Mark insisted on carrying. They were mostly for emergencies, but you could send short texts too. I pulled mine out to message him, but before I could type anything, I saw he'd already sent me something. He said he was lost. My chest tightened immediately. Mark wasn't careless. He knew better than to wander too far, especially that late in the day. Another message came in. He said he'd somehow ended up back at the lake. I told him to stay there and not move. Getting more lost at sunset was the worst thing he could do. I told him I was on my way. I grabbed my headlamp and started walking fast. Not running, but close. The woods looked different as the light faded. Familiar paths felt wrong. Trees looked closer together. Sounds carried strangely. Halfway there, my messenger buzzed again. I expected him to ask where I was. Instead, the message said, "I can see you." I stopped dead. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I spun around slowly, shining my light between the trees. I didn't see anyone. I messaged back, telling him I wasn't anywhere near the lake yet and that I couldn't see him. I didn't wait for a reply. I started moving faster, my breath coming out shaky. When I reached the lake, it was empty. The water was dark and still. The waterfall whispered quietly, like it always had. I could see the entire shoreline. There was nowhere Mark could have been hiding. I called his name. My voice echoed and disappeared into the trees. No answer. The sky was almost black now. Panic settled in deep. I didn't know where he was, and I didn't know how long I could safely stay out there. I made the decision to go back to camp. As I walked, every sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. My own footsteps sounded too loud. Then I saw it, an orange glow ahead. The campfire was lit. Someone was standing next to it, Relief flooded me. I actually laughed out loud, thinking Mark had made it back somehow. Then the figure turned. It wasn't him. The person stood there for just a second, their face half lit by the fire. Then they ran. Fast, too fast, straight into the trees. I froze. I rushed into camp, my hands shaking. That's when Mark burst out of the woods from the opposite side. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He said we had to leave, right now. As we packed, he told me what happened. He said someone had been walking toward him at the lake. At first, he thought it was me. But as the person got closer, he realized something was wrong. The man didn't say anything. He just smiled. A slow, stretched smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mark said his face looked wrong, like it didn't quite fit together the way a normal face should. That's when Mark ran. We didn't finish packing neatly. We just grabbed what we could and left the rest. The hike back felt endless. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound felt too close. We made it to the car and drove away without speaking. Even now, years later, I think about that first night. The sounds outside our camp, the feeling of being watched. I don't think it was a coincidence. I think someone was out there the whole time. And I don't camp in places like that anymore. This happened in 2021, but I swear I can still feel it in my chest when I think about it. I'm Evan, and I've always been the kind of person who needs time alone now and then. Not the dramatic kind of alone, just quiet, trees, no phones buzzing, no people talking over each other. Back then, I lived in a small town called Red Hollow, the kind of place where everyone knows your business, whether you like it or not. Just south of town, there was this massive stretch of woods locals called Pine Needle Flats. That wasn't the official name, but that's what everyone called it. Flat land, thick trees, no hills, no views. Just endless trunks and shadows. I used to go out there a few times a year. Nothing extreme. Short solo camping trips. My older sister Lena hated it. She said going out there alone was asking for trouble. We argued about it all the time, especially after our dad passed. She worried more than she needed to, but I always brushed it off. That weekend, I felt restless in a way I couldn't explain, like my skin was buzzing. I told Lena I was going camping for one night, maybe two. She rolled her eyes and told me to text when I got there. I said I would. I didn't. I packed fast. Backpack, tent, food, flashlight. The basics. I drove out past the edge of town until the road narrowed and the trees crowded in on both sides. There was a dirt pull-off where I always parked. No sign, no marker. Just a gap in the trees that looked darker than the rest. I hiked for almost 2 hours. The woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. No wind, hardly any birds. The ground was soft with needles, and the trees were packed so tight that even in daylight it felt dim. The campsite was nothing special. Just a small clearing where the trees pulled back enough for a tent and a fire. I set everything up slowly. I wasn't in a rush. The air was warm, and the sky was clear. I made a small fire, sat down, and ate trail mix while listening to the forest. At first, it felt good, normal, safe. But when the sun started going down, everything changed fast. 1 minute the woods were full of noise. Bugs, birds, leaves shifting. Then it was like someone flipped a switch. Silence. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. I sat there staring into the fire, trying to ignore how uncomfortable it made me feel. About 20 minutes after dark, I heard something that didn't belong. Music. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was faint, thin, like it was drifting through the trees. I tilted my head and listened harder. It was real. Some old classical tune, slow and scratchy, like it was coming from a busted record player. Who brings a speaker into the middle of nowhere like this? I stood up and turned in a slow circle. The sound came from deeper in the woods, far enough away that I couldn't see anything. No lights, no fire glow, nothing. I told myself it was another camper, maybe someone setting a weird mood. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. The song kept playing and playing. Same notes, same timing. No change at all. After a while, it started to mess with my head. The music felt wrong, like it didn't belong to the forest. Like someone had stitched it into the silence. After about half an hour, I grabbed my flashlight. I told myself I'd just walk closer, figure out what was going on, and head back and sleep. Simple. The deeper I walked, the louder the music got. Way louder than it should have been. My footsteps sounded too loud on the ground, like the forest was listening. I started to realize I'd only brought my flashlight. No knife, no spray, nothing to protect myself. That's when the fear really kicked in. The music was close now, 30 feet, maybe less, but I still couldn't see anything. Then my flashlight beam caught something behind a tree. A speaker. Big, old, boxy. The kind people had in the early 2000s. It was sitting there like it had been carefully placed. No cords, no bag, no person. I swept the light around. Nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just trees. I walked up to it, heart pounding so hard it made my ears throb. The buttons were worn down, like they'd been used a lot. I found the power button and pressed it. The music stopped. The silence that rushed in felt heavy, like it pressed down on my chest. I stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen. Someone to step out, someone to laugh. Nothing did. I hurried back to my campsite, trying not to look over my shoulder. When I saw my fire still burning, I felt a rush of relief. I sat down and tried to calm myself, telling myself I was overreacting, but the feeling didn't go away. Something felt off, like the woods were holding their breath. I reached for my backpack to grab my knife and spray, just to feel better. They weren't there. I checked again, then again. My matches were gone too. My cooking gear. Everything useful. My stomach dropped so hard, it felt like I might throw up. Someone had been there. While I was gone, I didn't think. I just started stuffing whatever was left into my bag. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely zip it closed. That's when the music started again. This time, it was closer, way closer. It wasn't drifting anymore. It felt like it was coming from all around me, bouncing off the trees. I ran. I didn't even bother putting out the fire. I tore down the trail, branches snapping against my arms, my breath burning in my throat. The music followed for a while, then faded. After about 15 minutes, I slowed down. The woods were quiet again. That's when my flashlight beam hit something on the trail ahead. My stuff, all of it. My knife, spray, matches, laid out neatly in a straight line, like someone had taken their time arranging it. I stood there staring, my heart pounding. I knew it was a mistake, but I took a step forward. That's when I heard footsteps. Fast, heavy, right behind me. I spun around and saw nothing but darkness between the trees. I ran again. I don't know how long I ran. 10 minutes, maybe more. I didn't stop until I hit the road and collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. I never went back to Pine Needle Flats. When I finally called Lina, she was crying. She said she'd had a bad feeling all night. I didn't tell her everything. Some things are easier to carry alone. I've never told this story out loud without my voice dropping a little. Even now, years later, it still makes my skin prickle. This happened back in 2016, when I was 23. I remember the year clearly because it was right after my older cousin, Mark, convinced me I needed time alone to reset my head. I'd just gone through a rough breakup and felt restless all the time, like my thoughts were buzzing. Mark was big into hiking and solitude, and he swore spending a few nights in the woods could fix just about anything. So I listened to him. I drove out to a remote stretch of wilderness in northern Montana, not far from a place locals called Pine Needle Basin. It wasn't a national park or anything official, just miles and miles of forest, hills, and mountains that didn't get many visitors. That area had a reputation for being quiet, almost too quiet. It was also known for wolves, mountain lions, and the occasional bear. Mark warned me about that more than once, which only made the place feel heavier in my mind. I wasn't a hardcore camper. I knew the basics. How to pitch a tent, start a fire, pack enough food and water. I'd been on plenty of long hikes, mostly with Mark or friends. But this was the first time I was truly alone. No phone signal. No nearby campsites. No people. That was kind of the point. I chose a narrow trail that didn't even have a proper sign. Just a faded marker nailed to a tree, half covered in moss. The trail cut through thick forest and followed a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. Somewhere in the distance, mountains rose like dark shapes against the sky. The nearest known campsite was over 4 miles away, near a lake that drew anglers and weekend campers. I avoided that on purpose. I wanted silence. I wanted space. The hike-in took most of the afternoon. I didn't see anyone. No voices. No footprints that looked fresh. The trail felt forgotten, like it hadn't been walked in weeks. When I finally reached a small clearing that looked flat enough to camp, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The clearing was ringed by tall trees that leaned inward, their branches overlapping like fingers. It felt enclosed, almost protected, but also watched. I brushed that feeling off and set up my tent near the edge. I stacked rocks into a fire ring and gathered wood while there was still daylight. As the sun went down, the forest changed. The colors faded. Shadows stretched. Sounds carried farther. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and tried to relax. I remember staring into the flames and thinking how small the fire felt compared to the darkness pressing in around me. Later, I leaned back on my pack and stared up at the sky. The stars were sharp and bright, clearer than I'd ever seen them. The valley below was silent. No wind, no insects. Just stillness. That's when I heard it. Crunch, crunch, leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. At first, I thought it was an animal. But the sound was too steady, too rhythmic. Whatever it was walking upright. I sat up slowly and stared into the trees. The sound kept coming, closer now. My fire crackled, throwing light between the trunks. I remember thinking, who would be out here this late? A shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was a man. He stood just outside the firelight, like he didn't want to step fully into it. He had a large hiking pack on his back. His face stayed mostly hidden in shadow, the firelight flickering across him in uneven flashes. We just stared at each other. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, "Sorry." The word barely carried, like he was afraid to say it too loud. Before I could respond, he turned around and walked back into the woods, same direction he'd come from. His footsteps faded, and the forest swallowed him up. I sat there for a long time after that, listening. My heart thumped harder than it should have. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself he'd just been looking for a place to camp and got spooked seeing someone already there. Still, the way he whispered bothered me. Hours passed. Clouds rolled in and covered the stars. The forest grew darker, heavier. My fire burned low, and I poked at it, trying to keep it alive. That's when I heard footsteps again. This time, they were fast, not careful, not steady, running. The sound tore through the woods like something being chased. I stood up, every muscle tight. The footsteps burst into the clearing, and the man from before stumbled into the firelight. He looked awful. His clothes were torn, and smeared with dirt. His face was streaked with grime, and his hair clung to his forehead in dark, greasy strands. He had a patchy beard and eyes that looked too big for his face. He was breathing hard, like he'd been running for a long time. I asked if he was okay. My voice sounded small to my own ears. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes flicked past me, over my right shoulder, just for a second. Then back to me, then behind me again. I told him it was late and asked if he was lost. I offered food, water, anything. He muttered that he was fine, that he was just hiking. His voice shook, and every few seconds his eyes snapped back to the trees behind me, like he was tracking something I couldn't see. I felt cold all of a sudden. I told him I could help him get out in the morning. He ignored that. Then he stared straight at me and asked, "Why are you here?" The way he said it made my stomach drop. Before I could answer, he glanced behind me again. I turned, my heart pounding, expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing. When I turned back, his face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Where are the others?" I told him it was just me. His breathing sped up. "Have you been following me?" he asked. I said no. I swear my voice trembled. His eyes slid past me again, but this time they stayed there, locked, unblinking. Then he whispered, "Then why is she standing so close to you?" I spun around. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just trees and darkness. When I faced him again, his expression had shattered into pure terror. He screamed and bolted into the forest, running straight into the dark, nowhere near the trail. I packed up immediately. I didn't even douse the fire properly. I grabbed what I could and left. Every step back felt like something was following me. I never went back. The man was never found. And sometimes, when I think about that night, I still wonder if he really was alone out there. Or if I wasn't. It was late July of 2018, one of those summers where the air feels heavy even in the mountains. I've always been the outdoorsy type. Hiking, camping, sleeping under the stars, all of that. Growing up, I spent a lot of weekends outside with my older cousin Evan, who pretty much taught me everything I knew about surviving in the woods. One night, Evan told me about these old fire lookout towers you could still rent out. Not modern cabins. Not tourist spots. Actual abandoned fire watch stations from decades ago. He said most of them were way out in the middle of nowhere, hours from the nearest town, and barely maintained. That alone was enough to grab my attention. I went home and started searching. Most of the lookouts had booked calendars and recent photos, but one stood out. It was called Pine Hollow Lookout, and it was tucked deep inside a stretch of forest known as Blackroot Ridge. There was almost nothing about it online. One faded photo, no reviews, no recent updates, and somehow it was available almost every day of the summer. That should have been my first warning. I booked it for 3 nights. The next morning, I parked my car at a barely marked trailhead just after sunrise. No other vehicles, no signs, just trees. I adjusted my pack and started walking. The trail was awful, not scenic, not peaceful, just thick forest that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. Branches scratched at my arms. The ground was uneven, muddy in places, rocky in others. After a few hours, the path became so faint it felt like I was guessing half the time. There were no birds, no bugs, just wind brushing through the trees and slow, whispery waves. After about 5 hours, I finally saw it. The lookout sat on top of a steep rise, barely visible through the trees. It didn't look tall like the towers you see in photos. It looked more like a crooked cabin lifted a few feet off the ground. Old, gray, still. Another hour later, I was standing beneath it. The stairs wrapped around the outside, creaking when I stepped on them. The wood felt soft, like it would give out if I put too much weight in the wrong place. When I reached the top, the view stopped me cold. Endless forest in every direction. No roads, no buildings, nothing. The inside of the lookout was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations. Just dusty wooden floors and windows on every wall. It felt like the place was watching me as much as I was looking out from it. Still, I told myself I was being dramatic. I cooked some food, sat on the outer walkway, and watched the sun dip below the trees. The quiet was deep, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. When night fell, I laid my sleeping bag out on the floor and tried to relax. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. About half an hour later, I heard footsteps. Not animals, not wind. Slow, heavy steps on wood. The stairs. My heart started pounding as I sat up. The lookout didn't have a lock, just a loose door that barely closed right. Before I could decide what to do, a figure stepped into view. It was a man, probably mid-50s, tall, thin. His hair hung past his shoulders in tangled gray-blonde strands. His clothes were worn and dirty, like he'd been sleeping outside for a long time. What scared me most was his face. He smiled like we were old friends. "Didn't expect company," he said, his voice calm and casual. "But this is a nice place to stay, isn't it?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him I'd reserved the lookout. He tilted his head. Funny, I was planning on staying here tonight. That made my stomach twist. There was nowhere else around. No campsites, no shelters. I asked if he was hiking through. He shrugged. Something like that. That's when I noticed it. No backpack, no flashlight, no supplies. Not even a water bottle. I lied and told him my sister was hiking up and would be there any minute. His smile vanished instantly. He stared at me, eyes flat and unreadable, then slowly nodded. "Well," he said, stepping back, "guess I'll come back another time." He walked down the stairs and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I tried to shake it off. People are weird, I told myself. Maybe he had deer hidden nearby. I made coffee and watched the fog lift off the trees. When I went down the stairs, my chest tightened. A piece of paper was tied to the railing. It said, "Sorry." My hands shook as I pulled it free. If he left that note, he had come back, which meant he'd been there while I slept. That day, I walked around the area, searching the forest. No tent, no fire pit, no footprints I could follow, nothing. That night, I stayed awake much later. I hung my lantern on the wall and stared out into the darkness. The forest looked different at night, deeper, closer, like it was leaning toward the tower. Around midnight, I climbed down to the edge of the trees to relieve myself. As soon as my light hit the tree line, something moved. Not fast, just enough to notice. I raised the lantern. "Hello?" Nothing answered. I ran back inside. I stood by the windows, watching the stairs. My stomach felt tight, like it knew something my brain didn't. I started packing my bag, stopping every few seconds to look outside. Then I saw him. He stood at the bottom step, completely still, staring up. It was the same man. No gear, no light, just waiting. I watched him for what felt like forever. Finally, he stepped back and vanished into the trees. That was enough. I grabbed my pack and left. I walked through the forest for hours, gripping my knife so tightly, my hand went numb. Every snap of a twig made me spin around. Every shadow looked wrong. When the sun finally came up, I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I still think about what would have happened if I stayed that third night. And I never look up old fire lookout rentals anymore. It happened in the fall of 2021. Back when I was 26, I had driven up to northern Maine to spend some time with my older cousin, Mark. He lived way out near the edge of the Pine Ridge Forest, in a quiet little town where nothing ever seemed to happen. No traffic, no streetlights, barely any cell service. The kind of place where the woods start right at the end of the driveway and just keep going forever. Mark and I used to be close when we were kids. We'd spend whole summers running around outside, building forts, getting lost in the trees, and daring each other to do dumb stuff. As adults, we didn't see each other much anymore. But when he invited me up for a couple of weeks, I figured, why not? I needed a break from work and city noise anyway. One night while we were sitting on his porch, he mentioned an old trail deep in the forest that hardly anyone used anymore. He told me locals avoided it and laughed it off like it was some small-town superstition. That alone was enough to get my attention. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, Mark had work, so I took my car and headed out on my own. I parked on the side of a narrow dirt road where the trees leaned in so close it felt like the forest was swallowing the road. There was no sign, no marker, nothing that said a trail even existed. Just a thin break in the trees that looked slightly more trampled than the rest. The path was rough. Branches scratched at my arms. Tall weeds brushed against my legs, and the air felt heavy and damp, like the forest was holding its breath. It took me almost 2 hours to reach what I'd come to see. Right in the middle of the woods sat an old hunting lodge. It looked wrong, like it didn't belong there anymore. The roof had partially collapsed, and chunks of wood were scattered across the ground. The logs were blackened with rot, soft and crumbling. The windows were broken, their glass long gone, leaving dark, empty holes that felt like they were watching me. I had originally thought about camping inside the lodge, just to say I did it. That idea vanished the second I got closer. The place smelled awful, like mold, wet earth, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something sour. The front door was hanging open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I leaned inside just enough to look around. The floor was uneven and covered in debris. I could hear faint dripping somewhere deeper inside. At the far end, I noticed another door that looked newer than the rest, almost out of place. I thought about going in farther, but something in my gut told me not to push my luck. I backed out and decided to set up camp nearby instead. I walked a short distance away, found a small clearing, and pitched my tent. As the sun started to go down, the woods changed. The light faded fast, and shadows stretched between the trees. The lodge disappeared into the darkness, until it felt like it was never there at all. I built a small fire and sat beside it, poking at the flames with a stick. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no distant animals. Just the occasional chirp of insects and the crackle of the fire. Then I heard it. A deep groaning sound, like wood bending under too much weight. It came from the direction of the lodge. It lasted only a few seconds, but it made my skin crawl. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe a tree falling somewhere nearby. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After sitting there for a while, I realized there was no way I was sleeping without checking it out. So I grabbed my lantern, added a few logs to the fire, and walked back toward the lodge. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. The beam of my lantern barely cut through the darkness. When the lodge finally came into view, my heart started pounding. The front door was closed. I know for a fact it had been wide open earlier. As I stepped closer, I noticed long scratches carved into the wood. Deep, uneven lines, like someone had dragged their fingers or a sharp object across the door over and over again. I reached for the handle and pulled. It didn't move. It felt like someone was pushing back from the inside. I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I turned and rushed back toward my campsite, my lantern shaking in my hand. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. My fire was out, not burned down, not smoldering, put out. Thick smoke hung in the air, like it had just happened moments before. I stood there frozen, listening, Hello? I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky. No answer. That's when I heard it. Soft laughter. It wasn't loud or playful. It was slow, quiet, and wrong. Like someone enjoying a private joke. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the trees, circling me. I didn't bother packing properly. I grabbed what I could and ran. Branches slapped my face as I followed the trail, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Every few steps, I thought I heard that laughter again, always just behind me. I never saw anyone. That almost made it worse. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I got in and drove, not looking back. I never told Mark what happened. I don't think he'd believe me anyway. All I know is this. Something was out there with me that night, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be alone. And if you ever find an unmarked trail in the woods that everyone avoids, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. I want to tell you about something that happened to me back in 2018, because it still messes with my head whenever I think about it. At the time, I was going through a rough patch. My girlfriend Mara and I had just taken a break, which everyone knows is basically a slow-motion breakup. I didn't want to sit around my apartment replaying every argument in my head, so I decided to get out of town for a couple of days, clear my head, be alone, that kind of thing. I drove north to a place called Black Ridge Forest, a massive stretch of wilderness that most people only know from old hiking blogs and half-forgotten trail maps. Deep inside the forest was an abandoned fire tower called Hollow Peak Lookout. I'd heard about it years earlier from a coworker who liked urban exploration. According to him, the tower hadn't been used in decades. Here's the thing, though. It wasn't legal to go inside it. The state had shut it down because it was falling apart, and there were warnings online about unstable floors and rusted supports. Still, I searched through forums and comment sections, and most people said it was probably fine. The newest post I could find was from 4 years earlier, but I convinced myself nothing serious could have changed. That should have been my first warning. I parked my car along a narrow dirt road, half hidden behind thick bushes. There wasn't a real parking spot, just a muddy dip where the ground sloped down. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed with food, water, a sleeping bag, and a small stove. I told myself I'd hike in, sleep at the lookout, and hike back out the next day. There wasn't a trail. Not really, just trees. Endless trees. I used a handheld GPS to keep myself pointed in the right direction, but most of the time I was pushing branches out of my face, stepping over fallen logs, and trying not to twist an ankle on hidden rocks. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No distant road noise, no planes overhead. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. After about 5 hours, my legs were burning and my shirt was soaked with sweat. That's when I saw it. The top of the fire tower stuck up above the tree line, thin and crooked, like a broken finger pointing at the sky. Up close, the tower looked worse than I expected. The paint had peeled off in long strips, and rust covered most of the metal. Still, when I pushed against the support beams, they didn't budge. The ladder was bolted tightly in place, though it groaned when I put my weight on it. I climbed slowly, every step echoing in the empty forest. By the time I reached the top, my arms were shaking. But the view stopped me cold. The forest stretched out forever, rolling hills of dark green in every direction. No towns. No lights. No signs of people anywhere. It felt like I was standing at the edge of the world. Inside the lookout, the space was cramped. One small room. A sagging cot shoved against the wall. A desk with deep scratches carved into it, like someone had dragged a knife across the wood over and over again. The windows were cloudy and cracked, and the air smelled like old dust and damp rot. I set up my sleeping bag, cooked a quick meal, and tried to relax. As the sun went down, the forest changed. Shadows stretched between the trees, and the sounds shifted. Birds went quiet. Insects took over. I stepped outside onto the narrow metal ledge and watched the last bit of light fade away. It was beautiful, but it also made me feel small, unimportant, like if something happened to me out there, no one would ever know. That thought stuck with me. An hour passed, maybe more. I was just sitting there when I noticed something moving far below, near the tree line. A light. At first, I thought it was a flashlight, but it wasn't white. It was orange, warm, flickering, like a flame struggling to stay alive. It drifted slowly through the trees, stopping every so often, then moving again. Whoever was carrying it didn't seem to be in a hurry. The weirdest part was how silent it was. No footsteps, no snapping branches, just that floating glow weaving between trunks. I told myself it had to be another hiker. But who hikes that deep into the forest at night with a torch instead of a flashlight? Eventually, the light vanished behind the trees and didn't come back. The forest went completely still again, like it was holding its breath. I was just about to go inside when I looked down. Someone was standing directly beneath the tower. They were in the small clearing at the base, close enough that I could tell they were staring straight up at me. I couldn't see their face clearly, just the outline of their body, and the faint glint of eyes catching what little light there was. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding way too loud. "You okay down there?" They didn't answer. We stood there like that for what felt like forever. Then the person lifted one hand, not quite a wave, more like an apology or a signal. Then they turned and walked back into the trees. No light, no sound. I remember telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just another camper checking if the tower was occupied. Still, I locked myself inside and crawled into my sleeping bag with my boots on. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it. The ladder, that slow metal creak. Someone was climbing up. Each step was careful, deliberate, like they didn't want to be heard, but didn't mind if they were. The sound grew closer, heavier. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out onto the ledge just as the creaking stopped. No one was there. I leaned over the edge. The ladder was empty. That's when footsteps exploded behind me. Fast, running. I didn't look back. I dropped onto the ladder and scrambled down, my hands slipping on the cold metal. Halfway down, I glanced up. A face appeared above the edge, watching me. I hit the ground and ran into the trees without stopping. I didn't look back until I reached my car. I drove away shaking.